So I'm going to kick us off. I'm Anne-Marie Slaughter. I'm the CEO of New America, and it's really my honor for me and also for Paul Butler, our President and Chief Transformation Officer, to welcome you and to get started on the first 100 days. Can civil society defend democracy? The answer is yes. But let me elaborate a little bit. I think it's worth reflecting just for a minute on what we're defending. I was at a summit last week in an interview, and the interviewer said to me, essentially, what is democracy? Don't worry, I'm not going to go into great length. I was an academic for a long time, but as the question was posed, I thought, we're all talking about democracy in so many ways, and we use it in many ways. For me, it's really three key points, and I think that's highly relevant to our ability to defend democracy. And the first is, it's, at least in this country, it's not just democracy. Democracy is government by the people. But that means government by a majority. We have a liberal democracy in the traditional sense of liberal, not the political sense, meaning government by the people that preserves the liberty of all people, which means defending minority rights. So the first marker, the first thing we have to watch is, are we protecting those who are not in the majority? Are we protecting their liberty and their rights? And if you think about, our own Constitution and the Bill of Rights, that Bill of Rights is an essential piece of what makes us a liberal democracy. Second, you need a democracy that is stable, a democracy that is not likely to slide into tyranny. And that, of course, was the founders' overriding concern. That is what the Federalist Papers are about. They are essentially saying we have to make sure that we don't have mob rule, and we have to make sure that actually this democracy does not quickly become the kind of taking over of power so that we go back to a king, a concern that does seem highly relevant. So there, of course, we have our checks and balances, and that is really what that's about. It's to make sure there is always someone checking and balancing someone else. And many of us, certainly in recent years, have argued that there seem to be too many checks and balances, that we can't get anything done. And I think there's a lot of frustration in the country about that. But now we're also seeing why that basic idea of three separate branches, and we're different there than the parliamentary systems where the executive and the legislature are really the same. We have three separate branches. Legislature's most important. Remember that. Then the executive, who's supposed to execute the laws, and then the judiciary, which was the least dangerous branch. It's a famous book by Alexander Bickel. It's maybe the least dangerous branch in normal times. I'd argue it's the most important branch in times of crisis. So the third, we focus on minority rights, checks and balances, and the judiciary, the rule of law. As long as we are in fact complying with the judiciary, and as long as the judiciary is honest and deciding consistent with the rule of law, then we have a democracy and we can play within those rules to actually change it. Last thing to say there, though, is that the checks and balances are not just government. They are also the press, the Fourth Estate, there's a reason that's in the First Amendment, and civil society, the rest of us. In 2016, after the election, I woke up and I thought, I'm going to read de Tocqueville. I'm going to read all of de Tocqueville. I know, I'm a professor. That might not have been the immediate reaction of most people, but I thought, I don't know this country. I'm going to go back and at least see what it was like in 1830. Well, I did read all the way through it, and I remember what all of you remember, which is effectively democracy in America rests on the passion of Americans for association, for what we would now call civil society. And that is a tremendous check as well, as a healthy, vibrant civil society. So that takes us to today. After these first 100 days, we're asking the question about civil society, but we're honoring the people who have gone first, because civil society, like any groups, university groups, law firms, ultimately also business and others, it's easier to stand up in numbers, but somebody has to go first. And the people we're honoring today are the upstanders, the people who have gone first, who've been willing to put their head above the parapet, which is a phrase I keep hearing, which I find quite alarming. Let us assume it's not a real parapet, but it does take real courage to stand up. And with that courage, and in the second 50 days of the first 100 days, you've seen people standing up, you've seen people realizing that, in fact, they can come together as members of civil society. And here, New America is a Think and Action Tank. We are a civil society organization, and others then will follow. So with that, it's time to get to our panels, and I just want to thank our fellow hosts, American University's Department of Politics, Government, and Economics. I love the fact that we have an academic Department of Politics, Government, and Economics co-hosting with us, and also CLASP, the Center for Law and Social Policy. So we are grateful to them. I'm also grateful to many of my colleagues at New America who really did all the work of making this happen out of a conviction that it should happen, for which we are grateful and we all benefit. With that, I think I'm handing off to Kevin Carey.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kevin Carey. I'm New America's Vice President for Education and Work. We have a packed agenda today, so I will be very brief. Want to say thanks to everyone here in the room for attending, also everyone who's watching online. We really appreciate your participation. Because I oversee our education and employment-related activities here at New America, I'm going to be moderating a discussion that's focused on three really pillars of our civil society, and that's higher education, law, and the media. We had Karen Attia from the Washington Post, who was going to be on this panel, but unfortunately she couldn't make it today. So we'll ask our other two panelists to kind of help fill in the gaps. But we're very pleased to welcome Michael Roth, the president of Wesleyan University, and William Traynor, the dean of Georgetown University School of Law. So please join me in welcoming them up to the panel. So, as Anne-Marie said, you're both here today because under different circumstances, you both made the choice to speak publicly about some of the actions the Trump administration the actions they've taken, the public stances they've made. So I wanted to kind of start there and ask each of you just to reflect a little bit about how you found yourself in this position, why you chose to speak the way you did, and what kind of feedback and reaction you've gotten from your colleagues, your constituents. I'm sure you have boards, alumni, et cetera, et cetera. What have these 100 days been like? Michael, why don't we start with you?
Sure. I spoke up thinking I would be in a large chorus of university presidents, and Wesleyan is a small university, and that I would be submerged somewhere like maybe in the baritone section, and the sopranos from the Ivy League would be, carrying the tune. But and I think I have spoken out against the anti-educational policy announcements of candidate Trump in 2016, and then also in the fall before the elections, very specifically about policies that seem to be directly in tension with the mission of my university, but very much in tension with the principles that guide American higher education. I tried to do that without saying that, so you should vote for someone else, or try to do it with as little partisanship as possible, but to say, hey, this is actually a policy that would destroy the things we claim to believe in strongly. And although my general counsel was sometimes had more Tums in his pocket than he would have otherwise, it just seemed to me that was the duty of a person in my position, is to defend the mission of the institution. Even the Calvinists who came back into favor after October 7th and wanting to institutional neutrality, even they had permission. If there was any doubt they were looking for permission, they had permission to speak to defend the missions of their institutions. They chose not to and had a cloak of institutional neutrality to wrap themselves in. I thought it was our responsibility to speak out. When the student, Khalil, was arrested at Columbia, I thought it was so extraordinarily shameful for this country to detain someone under those conditions, so clearly aimed at stifling speech. Speech I disagree with very strongly, so all the more important then to defend the right for that person to have to make those kinds of utterances. It seemed to me really important that university people speak out in favor of this basic principle of civil society, which is that you can have a relationship with the government, you can even be subsidized by the government, but that does not mean you have to line up behind the leader. And that seemed to me obvious, and I guess I didn't think very much about whether I was sticking my head up and gonna get whacked or something like that. It just seemed like that's what one does in America. We've been saying it since 9/11. When you see something, say something, and it just seemed really important, since I had a microphone, to use it.
So, I got a letter from the interim U.S. attorney for the District of Columbia, and it said, "I have heard that Georgetown Law is teaching DEI." And I will not hire any of your graduates, and I will not allow any of your students to work as interns in the U.S. Attorney's Office until you've convinced me that you're not teaching DEI. And I have to say, when I got the letter, my first reaction was, this can't be an actual letter. This has to be. It just, I actually, we have a threat assessment person at Georgetown, and it actually gives you a sense of where we are today, that we have a threat assessment person. And I was about to call them and say, is it possible to hack into a DOJ email address? But then I was convinced to know that this was genuine. And I mean, I do think for me, it is something that you think about the personal stakes. This is an administration that, we've seen is very focused on retribution. So, that's something that, I did think about. But it was also clear that I had to speak. First of all, just as an academic, there's a clear line for academics, which is the government can't dictate what you teach. It's clear in constitutional law. That's a core First Amendment principle. The government can't dictate what you teach and who teaches it and what your curriculum is. And then the second piece that really resonated with me is, this goes back to to mission. Georgetown is a Jesuit and Catholic university. And so kind of at the core of Georgetown is, and it's not about a particular creed, it's about fostering inclusive environments that have dialogue and where everybody can flourish. So the idea that we could not carry out our mission, it was outrageous. So I wrote the letter very quickly, and ran it by the university president, and then sent it out. I have to say, I was, it's striking. We're in a moment where I think we're all very conscious of putting your head above the parapet, and I'd anticipated that I would get as I have more than once, people criticizing from both sides. I was just so reaffirmed that I got hundreds of emails and letters, from, obviously progressives, but the chair of our board, who's very conservative, Eugene Volokh, who's very conservative. I mean, there was no person, there was no kind of intellectual who criticized where we had come. So I think, again, it's the government, and particularly a prosecutor, but the government can't dictate what universities teach. And you have to be able to honor your mission. And if you are a university that has a commitment to inclusion and to helping people flourish and to dialogue, the government can't tell you not to pursue your mission.
So, Michael, you talked about thinking it would be a chorus, and it wasn't at first, right? And so a chorus is a group of people all reading from the same song sheet at the same time. We can identify higher education, law, and the media all as distinct sectors with collective interests, all of which are being subject to threat and intimidation by the Trump administration in a way that feels very familiar to anyone who's a scholar of autocracies and democratic decline. It strikes me that one of the challenges that in, quote, normal times, all of the institutions in these sectors are competitors. Mm-hmm. They may have shared values, but you're competing for professors and students, or in the case of law, for clients, in the case of the media, for advertisers and clicks. How does that play into it, and how does a sector under threat translate its collective interests into collective action?
It's a great question, and in higher education there is a strong element of competition among the schools, and that runs through lots of things we do. Some more important than others. From sports to media attention to lots of other topics. And it might seem that one of the reasons that collective action took some more time than many expected was because we're not used to cooperating. I don't think that's true. I think the reason is very simple. It is fear. I think people were just scared of their students. They're scared of their boards, and now they're very afraid of the administration's capacity to harm their institutions and the people in the institutions. So I had a good friend write to me saying, I think you're wrong to speak out. You'll be fine. You've been overpaid for years. You can get fired. You'll be fine. You want to write. You want to read books anyway. But they'll come and they'll arrest people who are washing dishes, or they'll arrest people who are on the grounds keeping crew. And that's what's going to happen because you're speaking out, which is the typical collaborationist dilemma. And like that we've done today, I've used this word autocracy because everybody wants to avoid the fascism debate, but it's a pure fascist playbook. That is that you put people in a position where they know what the right thing is to do. It's not that hard to do in normal times, but there's a person with enormous power who could hurt you very badly or hurt the people you care about, people at your school, your students, your international students, your international faculty. And so you're scared to do the thing you know is the right thing to do. And so you make adjustments. You do the wrong thing in order to protect people, which is the right thing. And the Trump administration has put many elements of civil society into this position. Where I wrote this piece about appeasement when the first law firm caved in. And I had people who liked the guys at that law firm because they're good old progressives. And they tell me, you can't say that about those people. They're protected doing their fiduciary duty. They're protecting. They're not going to make $20 million next year. They would have made $30 million, or they'll make 5 instead of 10. And that's their duty, is to protect their bottom line. And they were afraid to do the right thing, so they protect their shareholders, or you protect your dishwashers, or you protect. This is the classic Vichy moment. I think John Gans said this in his Substack. And it is horrific that in America, we find ourselves in a moment where the basic principles of civil society that we know by heart, we can't act on because we're afraid to do so.
Bill, can you talk a little bit, maybe in a dual role as someone who is in both higher education and law? It does feel like a lot of these big law firms have been more apt to try to make a deal, however one wants to characterize that. Can you speak to a little bit about that dynamic and whether there's hope to push things back in the other direction?
Well, so really starting with Paul Weiss. Paul Weiss, it goes back to, the way in which autocracies scare people. Paul Weiss is one of the most profitable law firms in the country, and it has a reputation, legitimate, as being, very progressive, very democratic, unlike, most other top law firms. So, there was a sense they were not randomly picked, right? There was the idea that, if you go after Paul Weiss, and if they cave, then everybody's going to say, well, Paul Weiss caved, so, and then also, and the ante is upped, right? So Paul Weiss was 40 million, and now it's 100 million. And so on one hand, the business people at the firm would say, we're a $2.5 billion industry, $2.5 billion a year. $40 million of protection money is nothing. And then also when I talk to people at firms, they also say, we would have done, much of this pro bono litigation regardless. So, I have to say, I do understand those arguments, but, this is a moment in which, our Constitution is in peril. And, it's absolutely essential that people stand up and do the right thing, because the stakes could not be higher. So, I think, what we're seeing right now is some really kind of most of the most profitable law firms, when they approach them, are caving, but not all, and I have to say the ones that don't, like a Jenner and Block or a Covington or a Perkins Coie, Wilmer, they are really, there are real costs for them. There are real costs for them, but it's something that we need as a society. It's absolutely critical.
One thing that struck me in the administration's engagement, both the letter you talked about, the way that it's gone after some of the Ivy institutions like Columbia and Harvard, there's an incredible clumsiness and almost incompetence to it, right? So, Bill, you said you thought maybe someone had the letter was so out there, you thought someone had maybe hacked the email. Allegedly, the letter that prompted Harvard to kind of take this very public stand was maybe sent in error, who knows? But even if it wasn't, if you read the letter, I think it struck one as the kind of thing where they literally couldn't accede to it. It went way beyond even the various, and we should just sort of say, blatantly illegal and in no way in keeping with the procedures or laws of the Civil Rights Act that they alleged to be enforcing. But it just blew past that, right? Harvard was going to have to go and ensure viewpoint diversity on a program level, faculty. Just the kind of thing that they could not say yes to. So what happens if at some future point we have a more competent autocrat in the White House with the same ambitions, but without perhaps the shambolic staffing and incredibly erratic approach to things, where people in your position, don't have, in some senses, the advantage of not being able to do anything other than stand up. How do these sectors prepare for that eventuality?
Well, I think it's important that that sectors identify their common interests, and one of the reasons this administration doesn't have to display that much competence is because it's attacking institutions that are not that well liked. I mean, Colombia screwed up massively in its handling of demonstrations. Maybe it was impossible, but nobody, even the people there, didn't like the way they handled those demonstrations. Nobody, I mean, nobody likes Duke, nobody likes Harvard. I mean, you know, there's a place, I thought I'd get a laugh. No, I got rejected at Harvard. I mean, I'm happy to see them get, right?
That's pandering.
Yeah, right. So they can go after Harvard, and everybody, they think you don't have to do it very well. I mean, because you're attacking, you go after trans athletes. I mean, all 15 of them. You know, and it takes a lot of people are brokenhearted about it, and a lot of people feel it's wrong. But most Americans aren't that concerned about them, and most Americans aren't that concerned about Harvard. So you don't have to do it well. All you have to do is get people used to the fact that the federal government, through the White House, can inject itself into civil society and tell private organizations what to do because they've given them money for other things. Or you say something ludicrous like you're protecting Jews with your Christian nationalist West Wing. I mean, but it worked. It worked for so many Jews that they're happy to have someone who says they're protecting them, and you're happy to have someone criticizing Harvard. What we have to recognize, I think, is that these are attacks on civil society, and if this becomes the new normal, then it's going to be so hard to win back the freedoms of civil society that de Tocqueville wrote about that I took for granted, because they weren't really enshrined in statute. They were habits of the country's democracy, and it's really hard to get them back if you don't stop this machine of authoritarianism while it's still in its early stages. And I do think it's in its early stages. But it goes after libraries. It'll go after churches, synagogues, and mosques. It'll go after anything that has an independent source of authority. And we have to recognize that and say, I'm standing with Harvard, or I would even stand with Williams if they were attacked. Because what's at stake is that the independence of all of this sector. Williams jokes always work.
So on one hand, the execution on a number of the steps is just poor. So the execution of some of the steps is very poor, but the whole strategy is very shrewd. Anne-Marie talked at the beginning about Tocqueville. One of his core ideas is that in a democracy like the United States, what saves you from totalitarianism is intermediary institutions. And what we're seeing right now is kind of a very strategic effort at attacking every institution that can challenge the executive. So we're seeing universities and press and courts and law firms very systematically. And we're also seeing, an attack on Congress. So, for example, the tariffs that Donald Trump is issuing, I think are blatantly unlawful. Congress did not delegate him that power. So, even Congress, which he controls, he's undermining. So, I mean, that's what we're seeing, and it's, I just, just to see the pattern and being executed step by step, and it may be churches next, but it's really attacking every locus that can challenge the executive. So I think it may be that civil society prevails, and then you think about a smarter, kind of more careful administration. How do you defend against that? I think one thing that you have to think through is kind of what are your red lines. Yeah. And stick to them, because you really, if it's a little bit over the red line, it's still over the red line. So for us, it was they were telling us Georgetown law what we could teach. government can't dictate curriculum. For Harvard, that letter was essentially saying to Harvard, we are putting you under receivership, right? So it's, so there will be times, where the risk will be kind of closer to the line. But I think you have to think in advance, what do you have to defend and what is absolutely unacceptable?
So there's been some discussion or some reporting around Big Ten universities potentially organizing kind of a NATO-like mutual defense pact. I'm a Big Ten graduate, Ohio State, 2025 national championship. Go Buckeyes. We wiped out the memory of Michigan's championship from 2 years ago, so no one remembers that now. Are there other discussions like that happening that you can talk about in higher education? Like, we all got to prepare ahead of time. We don't know who they're going to go after first, and so we've got to show solidarity and then signal it as a kind of deterrent. If there are things you can talk about, or if there are discussions that you've been involved with, would love to hear about it.
Sure, I could talk a little bit about that. I mean, not because some of it's secret. I don't know that of any. Nobody would tell me a secret. So the AAC&U, as most of you probably know, has worked on this statement and in the last week or so has several hundred academic leaders signing on to it, and I think that was a big step, because I've been asking many of those people to sign something for the last month, and it took a while, and I think the AAC&U has a great convening power, and Lynn Pasquarella and her team did a great job with the American Academy as well, and getting that going. Rutgers, faculty at Rutgers, passed a resolution that they would come to the defense of, or they would like other schools, and Rutgers first among them, come to the defense of other schools. It seemed to me paradoxical that the State University of New Jersey would come to support Harvard financially in its litigation against the government. That didn't make any sense to me. But I think the expression of moral support actually counts for a lot. And in some cases, when they go after schools that are less financially strong than Harvard is, the material support will really matter. I've been advised by a person who runs a big hedge fund that I should go to the law firms that made deals with the government, because they feel very guilty right now, and so that they would take on pro bono cases from the universities. If anyone's here from those firms, that because I do think there's the court. We find ourselves, those of us who have thought democracy was about citizen practice, we find ourselves now relying on the courts with some trepidation, but with some hope too. And I do think that institutions in civil society can come to the aid of one another as need be. As these attacks will continue, I'm sure, over the next hundreds of days.
So, I mean, I think it's, the fact that 400 university presidents have signed on to defend Harvard, that's very powerful. And, my sense from talking to people is, it just snowballed over time. It was, can you get to 100? And then when you're at 100, then it's 200, then it's 300, then it's 400. And there's a shift. And we were talking about that before. At the beginning, it's like, I don't want to stand out by signing this. And then at the end, it's like, I don't want to stand out by not signing this, right? And, there's, it does build. One of our alumni, after my letter, came up to me and he said, I work for a government agency. I was told to fire 2 probationary employees. And they gave me the letter to sign and said they were being fired because of poor performance. And he said, I was inspired by your letter and I refused to sign. So I think it builds and builds and builds, and that's what we're seeing. I mean, I'm much more optimistic than I was a month ago. The other thing, though, just on when groups come together, I think just as a strategic matter, you've got to think about what the group is. Right, so I think if I were to get the top 15 U.S. News law schools to denounce something, I don't think that would be powerful, because I think that would look like this is the elite position, right? Whereas I think there's a power to the Big Ten doing that. So again, I think everybody gets support. You want to build momentum. I think you also have to be strategic about and thinking about what group is it that's speaking, that taking the lead.
Yeah, and I think social movements in civil society that run through education have to run through students.
Yeah.
I mean, it's one thing to have hundreds of university presidents, but it's another thing to have millions of students. And I do know of some faculty leaders and others who are trying to spread the word organically through the large schools, big public institutions, community colleges around the country to make sure that students understand the threat to their education. And they don't want the government telling their schools how to teach them. They don't want the government telling them how to behave. They don't want even the president of the university telling them how to behave. So if there's a student movement against this growing autocracy, I think that chances for success would be much greater.
And I think that can happen and that will happen. So one of my concerns, when I signed the letter is, the interim U.S. attorney was saying, I'm not going to hire your students for internships. I'm not going to hire your graduates for jobs as assistant U.S. attorneys. So one of the things I thought is, how are students going to feel about me saying, I'm not going to deal with you because it's their internships that are on the line. And one of the things that was very powerful to me is, I got hundreds of emails from students, expressing their support, and I did not get one from a student who's saying, you're giving up an internship that I wanted. So I think that's, as we're thinking about the future, I think the students are very powerful, and I think they can be mobilized.
We have time for one, maybe two questions from the audience. Yes, Kimberly. Do we have a microphone? Anyone?
So I have a loud voice if you want to just use it. The question is, in that letter, I believe the call was for constructive engagement. And I'm wondering if you could address what constructive engagement would look like, given the background that you've presented us with today. Sure. I believe the letter that you described, that the heading of it was a call for constructive engagement. So my question is, what is that constructive engagement at this particular time, given the background that you've provided us with today?
That's your letter, not mine. I didn't talk about constructive engagement.
The letter from the AA.
From the AAC&U, yeah. So I think that the AAC&U statement is meant to point to a time when colleges and universities might have political disagreements with whomever's in power, but they get along well enough to engage in the joint effort of providing greater access to education for American citizens, to support research that is in the public interest, and to obey the statutes that schools have to obey. The Obama-Biden administration said to colleges and universities, if you don't change your Title IX policies and make women safer on campus, we will take away all your research funding. I mean, that language is there in the Obama era. They just didn't do it. They just said, so you have to change, and we're going to work with you to change. But people said, you're bullying us. And then you had a conversation about that. That was constructive engagement. So the Trump administration can, I think, say, we believe that these civil rights statutes demand colorblindness and not anti-racism. And so we want to see how you're going to be colorblind. Now, I don't think colorblindness is the way to go, but I think they're in charge of that. And so I would have to work with them and show, yes, we're complying with the colorblind approach to civil rights, and then we would have that kind of engagement where they have their legitimate spheres of interest and power, and the universities have their autonomy relative to their support and authorization that they get from the government.
One more question. Yes, sir.
Hey there, point of alumni privilege, Wesleyan University, class of 1998. So it's good to see you here, President Roth. More of an observation that I'd appreciate some feedback on. One thing that has kept me up at night for a long time is the erosion of the separation between government and public influence and what happens in institutions of education, even but before institutions of higher education. And I'm just curious, we've been seeing the way school boards have been either taken over or pressured by folks with very specific political interests, and this sort of license and entitlement to dictate what happens within a school. I feel like there's been a big shift in the public politicization of who gets to decide what gets taught to not just my kids, but to any kids. And I'm just curious what relationship you see seeing those trends over the course of the last decades and the sort of intentional dismantling of that separation around what happens within schools. Do you see a connection there, and how does that play out on the pressure you're getting in institutions of higher education?
Yeah, thanks very much. I'll answer as quickly as I can. I do think it's part of a general decline of trust in any expertise at all, and especially the expertise of educators, teachers, professors, and I think at the local level in school boards, it's been, as you point out, it's been fierce. And teachers who have a good sense of what students need to read and learn in order to develop as individuals, their expertise in that regard has been challenged by parental groups, and I think partly because expertise in general has had an erosion of trust. In higher education, I think there's been an organized effort to delegitimize the expertise of higher education. It's been extremely successful, as you know, and we in higher education have not, I think, seen ourselves as part of civil society like other associations. I think we've been too complacent about seeing ourselves as somehow even above civil society, because the person who has these local associations, the Rotary Club, doesn't have a PhD. And so we had, I think, divorced ourselves from civil society when it was convenient for us to do so, and therefore were surprised that people didn't like us as much as they used to, or didn't believe we had earned their trust. And I think Trump is leveraging that distrust in expertise in general, and distrust and really antipathy to what people perceive as the condescension of higher education, because we in higher education have allowed ourselves to be too divorced from the other elements of civil society.
I think that's really very powerful. First point I would say, it's not just a decline in faith and expertise, it's a decline in faith and truth. So, what we're seeing, which I think I would have thought was inconceivable, was, a sense that it's all up for grabs. And, I'm in favor of evolution and you're a creationist and we each have our own beliefs. So I think that underlies the lack of faith and expertise. And then I think, one of the things that I think we at universities have to do a better job of is explaining what we do and why it's important to society. I think that's critical in turning this around.
Please join me in thanking our guests.
All right, everyone. Thank you guys so much. We're going to move at a kind of a rapid clip, given the number of panels that we have and speakers that we have. And so I won't go into too many introductory remarks, and would love to introduce our next panel on the question of, are we in a constitutional crisis? So we'll be joined by Bill Kristol, who is the editor-at-large of The Bulwark and founding director of Defending Democracy Together, focusing on strengthening American democracy and defending constitutional norms. He was the founder of the Weekly Standard and edited the magazine for 2 decades. Lauren Schulman is the founder and CEO of Future State, a nonprofit dedicated to building a stronger civil service and safeguarding American democratic institutions. Until January 2025, she was the Associate Director for Performance and Personnel Management at OMB, the Office of Management and Budget. And Mary McCord is Executive Director of the Institute of Constitutional Advocacy and Protection and a visiting professor of law at Georgetown. She was the acting Assistant Attorney General for National Security at the U.S. Department of Justice from 2016 to 2017 and Principal Deputy Assistant Attorney General for National Security from 2014 to 2016. So if the panelists could kindly join me here. So we can just get to it. Are we in a constitutional crisis? And I'll start from my immediate left.
Yes. My only four-sentence addition would be, I mean, it is a constitutional crisis, and therefore, and many of the fights take the form of constitutional fights, either in courts, obviously, and the lawyers, I think, and the judges have done a good job, certainly relative to other institutions in America in these first 100 days. And also Congress has a constitutional role, et cetera. But it's a little too narrow a formulation in general. We could have a functioning constitution. We had a constitution from 1896 to 1954. Plessy v. Ferguson was good law. It was the law of the land. And the society functioned with that system, right? You could have a very nasty, nativist, bigoted, authoritarian-ish system with all kinds of powers being exercised, as they're trying to exercise them now, by the federal government, all kinds of lack of accountability, and still sort of have constitutional forms, and have some real ones, incidentally. It's not like it's nothing. You still preferred to probably be in America, even in the South, even if you were black in 1920 than in, I don't know, South Africa or something. So there are advantages to having some constitutional structure, but it's not, one has to really look at the actual conditions of society and of governance and of the polity beyond the formal constitution, I would say.
So this is so interesting because I've resisted this for a long time because my view was we're not in a true crisis until there's outright defiance of court orders. But now what we've seen is that line might not be as bright as we might have thought, because my view had been that so long as the government is still in court defending what it's doing and saying, oh, no, 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 we didn't actually violate, let me explain, this is how we interpreted your order to what we interpreted it to do. And so long as they were still filing appeals instead of just outright saying we're not going to abide, that we weren't really there. But now I think we're to the point of sort of the ridiculousness and absurdity of some of the government's arguments and refusal just to actually do things like facilitate the freaking return of Abrego Garcia, like meaning call up Bukele and say, send him to us. Like, it's getting absurd, right? Arguing facilitate only means, oh, if he's presented here at the border, we will let him in. Well, of course, we'll immediately put him into detention and give him actually some due process that he didn't get. When everyone knows facilitate means something else. So I do think we're there. We're not yet to that point where the Supreme Court, like, there's still been enough like wiggle room about some of the things they've said that the government is still making arguments. They are not claiming we're defying. They're still making arguments. So it could get even more bright line than this. But even if you put aside that as a measure, executive action after executive action after executive action is just steamrolling the other two supposedly co-equal branches of government, right? Ignoring statutes, dismantling departments and agencies that were created by Congress and can't be dismantled by the executive, cutting off funding appropriated by Congress for specific purposes that the executive has no authority to alter. Steamrolling judges, see what I just said a few minutes ago, by not really directly responding to court orders, and then also sending Department of Justice lawyers in to argue cases where they don't have answers to the judge's questions. Answers. I mean, I was a prosecutor 20 years before I was head of national security. I've certainly been reamed out by a judge. Everyone who's a prosecutor has, or a lawyer ever. But I never couldn't answer the court's questions. The court might not have liked my answer, but if you go to court, you are prepared and you have talked to your client. I mean, my client was the United States, so, it's not, you're making sure that you are representing the official position of the United States. And we have lawyers going in and saying, I can't answer that question. I don't know. I've been instructed to say X. I mean, this is just not I started in the Department of Justice in 1994. I've never seen anything like this. So I do think because of that, we are in a crisis.
So it's embarrassing to slightly disagree with Mary, though I very much agree with her latter points, because I think there's a risk in making the debate about the constitutional crisis too legalistic. And that ignores the crisis part, which is we are seeing our institutions that make the Constitution, like the Constitution is not self-executing, that execute the Constitution. Those institutions are being broken before our very eyes without pushback or redress in a way that we've been able to effectuate permanently in some ways. So yes, at the outset, there's a flood of actions, executive actions and otherwise, that are on their face counter to law or counter to the Constitution. And that itself kind of shifts the overturn window of the flooding the zone. But the two pieces that really concern me are things that I worry about being irreversible and things that I worry about breaking legitimacy of some of those institutions. One is the corporate takeover or maybe oligarchic takeover of public agencies, public hiring, public services, public data by an individual who has no constitutional role, Elon Musk, and everyone who works with him. And importantly, I think he's doing so in a way quite purposely so that those cannot be rebuilt easily, or if at all. Even if courts go in and say you did that wrong, you need to start over again, it's going to be incredibly challenging to reconstitute some of these bodies of work. And notice a key word that I said in that: public. These are ours. We paid for them. They were for our public good, public ends, and they're being taken away and dismantled without our role in that. The second is in what I would say, there's a lot of ways to frame this, but the delegitimization and politicization of public employees and public institutions, whether by and those that we rely on for our safety, for disaster relief, for law enforcement, for Social Security, by making those politicized, by making us not trust that we will receive them when we will deserve them fairly, or they should also be impartial under the law, that those institutions should be dedicating their services in such a way. If we're unable to trust that that's possible, if they're being politicized and delegitimized in that way, that to me is as much of a constitutional crisis as what we are seeing in the courts right now, which is one really important facet of the conversation, but not the only one. I think the last thing, coming back to the earlier point on the public agencies, what's clear to me in that this is a purposeful delegitimization and destruction is that there's no transition plan. Like, it's totally legitimate to say, I disagree with it, that like some of these functions shouldn't be done by the federal government, they should be done elsewhere. But they didn't do that. They didn't take the moment to say, I'm going to hand this off to the state's health and human services. Or I'm going to hand this off to universities who might be able to handle public health data. None of that happened. This is a purposeful moving our reality that isn't just a constitutional crisis. It should be more of an existential crisis about how we think about our society in America.
I just had one point on, so picking up on those two, just to give an example in a way of why the Trump administration announced Schedule F, which is turning 50,000 civil servants into political appointees Thursday. That may stand up in court, incidentally. I don't know if they followed every jot and tittle of the Administrative Procedure Act in putting it into place, but they might, and that's not constitutional. That's based on, even if it were overturned, would be presumably because it goes against the 1873 statute. You could have many more political appointees. Maybe we should have more, incidentally. Maybe there should be 8,000, not 4,000. Maybe we should go back to 1,000 and have a British-type system where there's just 2 people in each agency. Maybe we should have different rules, as we have had for the FBI, and have 1 or 2 political appointees in the Education Department and have 150, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe the percentage of State Department ambassadors should be 1/3 political appointees and 2/3 career, or different. It's changed over time. But let's just assume they do it all legally. What if we end up with 50,000? What if we end up with 250,000 political appointees, hireable and fireable at the will of the president or of the agency heads? That's a different system. It's not constitutionally forbidden, probably. The courts might tinker with it at the edges, but might not, but wouldn't. But we would be living under a different kind of government. Now, maybe you'd have a decent president, and it wouldn't be that bad. We had good presidents early when the smaller systems existed, and much smaller federal government, of course. But how does that look? And how does that look in the Defense Department? If, again, military promotions are not mandated, but the system we have is not constitutional, And a lot of it is customary and norms. It's not really even legal exactly. And you do want the president to occasionally interfere and shake up sort of a, you scratch my back, I'll scratch your back kind of military promotion system and get some people promoted who have been heterodox in their time and so forth. But again, in practice, if a president intervenes with good intentions and sometimes at least good results, once or twice in the course of 8 years, it's a different system than the total politicization of, let's say, promotions within the military, and not just for general officers, but all the way down the thing. So I do think it's very important to have a sort of broad view of the system that we are in danger of moving towards, and that some people want to move towards, and are pretty explicit about it. This is not like I'm making something up here. They've written all this stuff. And so, they're doing it in a fairly effective way. For all the incompetence, it's sort of like the mafia's incompetent, they don't rub off everyone they're supposed to rub off. They occasionally shoot some innocent people. Occasionally they shoot themselves in the foot, literally or something, because they're not the highest quality hitmen and so forth, They can still do an unbelievable amount of damage and can still end up in a system that is, in effect, that is contrary to the kind of liberal democracy, rule of law, liberal democracy, but also decent society, and also a place where we have decent civil military relations and intelligence agencies under control and so forth. I mean, there's so much stuff that can happen that if we focus a little too narrowly on the courts, we need to focus on the courts. It's extremely important for now and always. But there's so many other things that can happen.
Well, I want to go back to something you said, Mary, earlier about the reluctance to calling it a constitutional crisis. And it's not just you, there are many people, because, earlier in the earlier panel mentioned the red line, right? Because when we set out a red line and it's been crossed, it requires action on our parts. So there seems to be a lot of resistance, and I think the administration recognizes that to a certain extent. And so they've maintained this squishy space. I mean, how do you find them kind of sitting in that space? Like the press conference with Bukele was, I think, a prime example of that. So what does that look like, the squishy space, and how do we get them to move beyond the squishy space? And do we want them to?
So, I mean, I think you're putting your finger on the question, right? Because are we prepared for what the reaction is when the red line is crossed? And I also think, at that point, what are the options? And is it too late for certain things to happen? And so I think now kind of like waving the flag and all the points Lauren made and Bill made, and hopefully the points that I made, these are all reasons why Americans shouldn't be waiting for that red line, right? It's time right now to be speaking up and speaking out and demanding something different from our government and our elected representatives. I mean, Congress right now is basically, like sleeping and pretending like they don't see some members of Congress. They got midterms coming up, right? Like, start hitting that right now, and we are seeing some of this happen. I also think it's important for people to understand sort of what is at stake and what we're losing. And, believe it or not, this is my second 100 days event today. I'm on like the 100-day event tour. So one of the things I talked about earlier today, I think is worth talking about, because so many times we have these discussions and we use terms like rule of law and due process, and it's like, do we have a common understanding of what we're talking about? So I've been trying to talk a lot about like what I think rule of law is. Some people may tinker with it, but it has 4 pieces, and I think they're all important in showing us what we are losing in this moment if we don't act. So first is just a system of laws by which the governed and the government agree to abide. 2 is transparency in the enactment and the enforcement of those laws so that you have stability and predictability, which has so many impacts, right? 3 is a legal system for adjudicating rights and responsibilities. And finally, 4th is neutral and competent and diverse and independent lawyers and judges as part of that legal system. And so when we think about what we're seeing like, damage to every single one of those pieces, right? The government right now not really seeming to agreeing to abide by a system of laws. In fact, what I see in almost every brief that the government is writing where it's defending executive action, it's just Article 2, Article 2, executive authority, expansive. Supreme Court told us in this summer, the president can do whatever he wants. He has expansive, capacious, core constitutional functions that Congress can't act upon, and nor can the courts. So they're taking this extremely aggressive view, and they are just, as I said before, steamrolling statutes, steamrolling the Constitution. Second, in transparency and enforcement, and even just the enactment, the executive orders are like coming out of a faucet at a pace that is insane. And if you read them, they're garbage. Like, they're so poorly written. I mean, they're garbage substantively, and they're horrible substantively. They're also just embarrassingly poorly written. I don't know who's writing these, or who's. Well, that's probably right. Actually, you're right, Anne-Marie. So anyway, but there's no transparency into how they're coming out, and there's no transparency into the enforcement decisions. I mean, why decide to, go arrest and handcuff a judge in the parking lot of her courthouse? You might have a beef with, and maybe she did something wrong by letting a defendant out the side door. But like, the ridiculousness of deciding that this is where you're going to go, and you're going to basically perp walk her across the parking lot, when this is somebody who you can do a summons to. You can ask the person to voluntarily, turn themselves in. Like, as a former prosecutor for, more than 20 years, like, that's what you do when somebody's not a flight risk, right? So there's no transparency there. In terms of the legal system, the courts, honestly, like, we should be every single day thanking the courts. They are working at warp speed. We had one judge who said pointedly to the government, there are no nights, there are no weekends. Every day is a business day. Don't tell me, you can't do something because it's in the middle of the night or early in the morning. That's what lawyers like my organization, ICAP, we've been litigating, since day one. We were able to bring the birthright citizenship within 24 hours of that executive order. So lawyers and judges are really working in this court system, but then that brings us to, where are we in terms of compliance with those orders? And last point I'll make on that, Trump's executive orders he's doing everything in his power, and this came up in the last panel, to make sure that those last two things fail, right? Part of that perp walk in the courthouse parking lot was to intimidate judges, right? Intimidate judges against issuing rulings that displease the administration. The pressure on the law firms by the blacklisting is to intimidate lawyers from taking up causes that are against the administration, representing people who are perceived as political foes of the administration, and hiring people perceived as political foes. If you have no opposition, you have no adversary process in court. You have one side there, and that adversary process is what's key to due process. The fact that when the government is going to take away something from the people in this country, they are entitled to notice and that opportunity to go before that legal system with fair and competent and independent judges and adjudicate their rights and responsibilities. But you've eliminated the opposition, and then you just frankly eliminate due process. You ship people off to El Salvador with no due process. I mean, we have really ticked away at each one of those. And there's one little last hopeful thing I'll say, which is, there is one thing that all 9 justices agree on, and that is due process, that these people deserve, and it's not just for people with documents, it's for people who are undocumented as well. Before you get deported to another country, to a prison in that other country, you get the right to challenge that in court. And so, we'll see what happens if and when we get to the point where there's outright defiance of that, and hopefully that won't happen. Right now, this pause in the Abrego Garcia case after 2 under seal filings tell me the administration's saying something to Bukele about getting him back, but probably trying to do it in some sort of way that they're going to try to save face. So, but hey, that would be better than outright defiance.
Bill or Lauren, would you like to respond?
I want to add a couple of points of context around whether or not this is a constitutional crisis. Like, one, I think if you asked much of the American public of whether or not they felt our system of government delivered for them and executed their rights fairly and got them the outcomes they wanted before the election, after the election, at any point in time, they would say no. So their constitutional crisis has been ongoing. So that the fact that we kind of narrow it down to a specific element is worthwhile and it's worth highlighting, but it's also something that is very dissonant with much of the American public. Mm-hmm. The second is that I think that we need to recognize that so many of the guardrails that kind of manage whether or not there is a crisis were already weak going into the administration, whether it be our courts, which with their kind of increasing politicization, Congress, which is entirely unable to act in many cases, whether due to the filibuster or gerrymandering or otherwise, our media and others. But more pointedly, in the context of this administration, some of the early warning system that we would have around whether or not things are challenged or failing has been taken away. And that, going back to my point around federal institutions, whether that they be inspectors generals being fired, the independent agencies, their boards and commissions being fired, so they're not able to hold administration or others accountable, senior executive service, who are often that senior level official who would be able to oversee and point out, no, this is not okay, or either being removed or put on administrative leave. So a lot of those functions that would be able to raise their hand and say, we have a problem here, have been either silenced or taken away from the challenge, even amidst all of these other functions being in a bad space. So no matter where your red line is of whether or not we're there, it needs to recognize that we are already in a very bad spot in terms of being able to manage it and be able to adjust accordingly.
We've heard Congress is, we have the constitutional crisis at its core is a congressional crisis. The congressional crisis at its core, on the other hand, is a crisis of the Republican Party. If Democrats control Congress, they've been doing a lot of oversight. They've been passing laws, forcing Trump to veto them. They might get Republicans to join them with them on some of those laws, overturning tariffs or insisting on due process and so forth. Maybe they couldn't. Congress has all kinds of problems. It's less functional than it was 30 or 40 years ago. We shouldn't romanticize that either. But at the end of the day, we have two major parties. One of them narrowly won the presidency and narrowly controls Congress, and it is so far on board an authoritarian agenda. And it's, that's very bad. That's like half the power in the country. So I think we need to use, I'm going to go against slightly the kind of political science I did for decades. We need to use the word power more. The levers of power matter a lot, and they're never 100, it's never white and black. Did we always have some corporate capitalism in America? Yes. Were you always better off if you got along with the President of the United States, with the executive branch? Yes. It's more so at the state level, even at the local level, famously, right? Corporate towns and all that, but at the federal level too. We've moved away, I'd say we moved away from that, some success, we maybe moved back in that direction a little bit in the last 10, 20 years. But again, it makes a huge difference if there's at the margin or sometimes, cases where you get along with the federal government and you do better, and the entire system is basically crony and corporate capitalism. So the real power in various spheres, universities, I'd say, now universities have actually had a lot of freedom and in a way have been the most, untrammeled part of America. It's interesting that Trump sees that he has a big interest in at least beginning to chip away at that too. So he wants to chip away at a lot of different things. Some will go much further than others. It's never going to look like in that respect, there's not one red line. There are many, many, many red lines, and a lot of them aren't red. They're kind of pinkish, and that's life. But that's how you slide towards authoritarianism. Maybe there's one moment. Sometimes there is in history, right? There's the Reichstag fire or something, and there's the Enabling Act, and that's it. And even then it wasn't it actually, because Germany was very different in 1938 or 9 from 1932 or 3, if you want to get sort of technical about it. But sometimes there's a much clearer line. But in many, many, many cases, there's two steps forward, one step back. What if we do get, I'm all for getting whoever we can get back from El Salvador. Does that precedent still stand that you can send people to a third country, not to just live there, but to be permanently imprisoned in some kind of gulag? Is that something that's okay with, maybe not even technically against the Constitution or against the laws, but one could change the laws. Congress could act. So I come back to Congress, which for me means coming back to the Republican Party, which maybe will begin to fracture a little bit if the polls go down. But for now, that's the core of the crisis, I think.
Well, speaking of Congress, we're going to have to slightly cut our panel short by a few minutes because we have Representative Crow. But I do want to, just ask this one last question. We are using these words that are very loaded, that don't have a lot of resonance for most Americans, right? Like democracy. Who really thinks about democracy until you start losing it? authoritarianism? What does it mean for most people? And so how is the message of this constitutional crisis reaching most Americans? And what will it take for them to really react?
I would just say, I mean, I don't know that any of us on this panel, maybe Laura, I don't think I'm very particularly good at knowing what messages reach most Americans. You know what? If we could just reach the elites, that would be enough for now. And I'm serious about this. There's endless discussions in Washington think tanks by people who've never been, honestly, in electoral politics, certainly never, most of them have not run for office, most of them haven't even been in campaigns and stuff. But I really think this message would work better. Americans don't understand that. First of all, Americans understand freedom and democracy a little better than we think. They weren't idiot. I mean, people do have some understanding of what World War II was about, what the Cold War was about. Why are they pro-Ukraine and anti-Russia? Because they're more like they have some natural affinity to the Ukrainian culture? I don't think so, because the democracy was attacked by a brutal dictator that was slaughtering and then continued to be brutal after the initial stage of the attack. So I'm not even that worried about but the elites have failed. And there's too many elites sitting around worrying about the American public's failing. Let's just, for the elites succeed, I kind of think the public will be okay.
So, I'm heartened. I'm just going to get really base here. Like, Americans are self-interested, and so they have to think that what they're doing they need to do to protect their own self-interest. I think the fact that many Americans now are actually worked up about the lack of due process, it didn't start out that way, and I think it was strategic on the administration's part. Let's start by calling people terrorists, and Americans won't care if we deport them. But when Judge Wilkinson said what many of us have been saying for a while, why would the government stop at alleged terrorists if they're going to not provide due process? That can happen to U.S. citizens too. And of course, we've already seen a few U.S. citizens, children, deported without due process. So, hey, if it takes worrying about yourself to wake up and get out and push your congressman, then use that. Tariffs and the economic impact on people, dismantling FEMA and the impact on people where there's disasters. That is where Americans have self-interest, and find the ways to appeal to that. I'd like to think, it's our greater angels, but I'm also a practical.
Two things, but one negative, one positive. So on the negative side, I think when you give Americans more that they have to worry about every day, and it's impacting their quality of life, that's where you end up changing minds. So do you worry that the IRS is going to actually deliver your taxes effectively, that you're going to get your Social Security check on time, that you're actually going to be able to receive disaster aid and be able to restart your business again after a hurricane? When you can't count on things that you thought you could count on in some way, or whether or not you get the weather report in some ways, given what's happening in NOAA, when you can't count on those things, and those are taking up the minds of all parents and families across the country, that's going to get people's attention. On the positive side, I think people will notice when you give them a better vision, when you have another version of what our democracy can look like that is about giving them outcomes that are actually benefit their lives as opposed to destruction. When you talk about what can be, and a better version of that recognizes past failures, as well as talks about the social and economic goods that democracy can deliver in a way that is very practical in recognizing past flaws, that's when they will also notice that's not where we are right now today. We could actually do better than that. So I think twofold, and there's much more to that, but we ran out of time.
Thank you all. And I would like to just invite you all to join me in thanking our panelists today.
All right. All right. Hello, everyone. Hello. We're going to move right along here. We're on a tight time frame. My name is Mary Alice McCarthy. I direct the Center on Education and Labor here at New America. It's my tremendous privilege and honor to introduce Congressman Jason Crow of Colorado. Congressman Crow, who represents the 6th District in Colorado, has a very illustrious bio. He is a former Army Ranger. He is a bronze medal holder. He is a successful lawyer. But I am not going to focus on his biography. I am going to focus on why it is we reached out specifically to Congressman Crow to ask him to be here with us today. And it's because we have an event that has brought together leaders who were among the first of their peers to speak up Congressman Crow has been speaking up about what is happening to our democracy, the democratic crisis that we're in for some time now, well before many of his peers in Congress. And Congressman, we've been using the phrase, putting your head above the parapet. And I thought to myself, you might be one of the only people in this room that has any idea what that actually feels like. So it feels fitting that you're here today.
I got out of that business years ago.
Right, there you go. So thank you. Thank you so much for joining us on this very, I know time is tight for you, so we really appreciate you making the trip over.
Thank you. Thank you, Mary Alice. Thank you, Anne Marie, and everyone with New America for inviting me here today. I have come to start measuring time in dog years, so we are now in the 700th day of the Trump administration, or so it has seemed. You know, but Hawthorne actually just said on time, he said, time flies over us, but leaves its shadow behind. And I've thought a lot about the meaning of time and those shadows that we all live with. And two dates in particular leave very long shadows for me. The first date is March 30th of 2003. I was a young paratrooper, a lieutenant, less than a year out of college, leading a platoon of 50 paratroopers in the Battle of Asamoah in Iraq. That's the battle that earned me my Bronze Star. It was the most fierce and sustained urban combat that the 82nd Airborne Division had experienced since World War II. And it was during that battle that my platoon, a platoon of over 50 men at the time, who had come from every section of the country, black, white, Asian, Hispanic, rich, poor, urban, rural, straight, gay, represented the melting pot that is this country, came together and fought together and had each other's backs. I saw an 18-year-old medic, and like most 18-year-old medics with just a couple of months of medical training, we named him Doc. And I saw Doc, who's now a Trump supporter, by the way, run out and risk his life under enemy fire to help rescue a 16-year-old Iraqi boy. The second date that casts a long shadow over me is January 6th, 2021, as I was trapped in the House gallery with my other members of Congress, erecting a barricade to prevent that mob from overcoming the House chamber. And it was there that my fellow veterans were on the opposite side of the door, trying to beat that door down and kill me and my colleagues. So I thought, how did we get here? How do we get from the point over a span of 20 years where we fought together, we were brothers and sisters, we would die for each other, to being on opposite sides of the door? And I thought about my upbringing, I thought about my childhood, growing up in a working class, Irish Catholic conservative family in the upper Midwest, largely of small business owners and construction workers. I thought about the people that I grew up with who've suffered with fentanyl, the small towns that have been largely shuttered and decimated. And I can just freely acknowledge that for most of those folks that I grew up with, the American dream is dead. It's dead. Right? The idea that you can own a home, you can retire in dignity, that your children's lives will be better than your own is out of reach for most Americans. Most economists point to 1980 as the date at which that changed. You can debate that, but it's what people feel. Then you add on top of that 2 decades of failed wars and the anger and the resentment as a result of those wars and the lies that led so many of my young brothers and sisters into those situations, still lives with us. Then you add on top of that the fact that the world moves faster than most folks can keep pace. And on top of that, a pandemic that shattered our sense of reality and safety in what was normal. So the social contract is largely broken for most Americans. We need a new social contract. We need a new bargain, and we need a new way of transmitting it and bringing it to the American people. The cost of housing needs to be addressed in new and bold and innovative ways. A failing education system that is not preparing our children for the 21st century needs a different look. And we have to recognize the fact as a parent of a 12-year-old and a 15-year-old, how terribly hard it is to raise children in modern America. Stressful as hell and very, very difficult. So what is the role of Dem elected officials, me and other members of Congress? Number one, we do need to acknowledge failed policies. There needs to be an element of a break, right? We don't have legitimacy to folks, and I'm not saying we throw the baby out with the bathwater because we do a lot of things well. I'm a proud Democrat. I'm a working class Democrat. I worked in construction to help put my way through college, and I became a Democrat because I don't want someone to answer my problems for me, and I don't want a handout. All I want is a level playing field, and that is the role of government, that is the role of elected officials to help ensure it's fair play. You can have an honest day's pay for an honest day's work. Getting back to the basics, but acknowledging that we have failed to deliver that for so many people. Acknowledging that in so many places where Democrats govern, working people can't afford to live. Right? And I'm not giving a speech on banging up on Democrats, because again, I am one because I believe we have the solutions and we have the character and the integrity to lead. Number two, we need to recruit the next generation of leaders and allow those leaders to thrive and to rise up. The talent of folks in my class and the classes after me is unbelievable. The talent in state houses and city councils and cities around America gives me great hope, because there are people stepping up to serve our country and community in remarkable ways right now. Number three, we need to do a little bit of our own zone flooding right now. Go everywhere and make the case to everyone. The simple fact is we have opted out of so many places in America. We can't win and create governing coalitions when we lose 90% of American counties, which is a fact. We must go everywhere, fight everywhere, and be willing to make the case everywhere. And we need to organize and mobilize. There is no secret sauce. If someone's sitting around waiting for the bumper sticker or the slogan or the mantra that's going to get us way out of this, you're going to be waiting for a long time. This is time to roll up the sleeves and organize and mobilize in the way that many of you all do already. And I know I'm talking to folks that are deep in this. And that is how we do it. So what is the role of civil society in this? If this is our responsibility and my responsibility, what role does civil society? Because I know the focus of this is 100 days in, what role does civil society play? Well, you are an indispensable and necessary partner in this project, and we cannot do it without civil society. Because the bottom line is, so many of the avenues of oversight, so much of the bandwidth that we normally have as members of Congress have been cut off. I can't even begin to explain to you how much harder it is to get information out of this administration. They have simply cut us off. So much of my information and my ground truth comes from you all. Comes from the NGOs and the nonprofits, the people with eyes and ears on the ground, not just here, but around the country. And we will rely increasingly on that in the months and years ahead. The other role, you have the speed and resources to provide support and advice to us that we are going to need. Our teams, my team, is completely overwhelmed. So much of the work that we now do is simply responding to my constituents, which is our fundamental role and will always be our priority, responding to our constituents who are losing jobs, who are facing deportation, who are dealing with the fear and anxiety of what's happening on the ground in Aurora, Colorado, and districts around the country. So we are going to need additional support and bandwidth and advice from you all. We also are going to need you to stick together. We have seen the attacks on law firms. We've seen the attacks on higher education. If there has ever been a moment where divided we fall, this is it. That doesn't mean always agreeing or always being of common mind, but sticking together in this fight right now couldn't be more essential. Lastly, we need to get outside of the bubble. And I have this phrase, you have to go rogue sometimes. I'm asking you all, get out everywhere in the country. Get out of the enclaves. Do less of the high-end retreats that people love to do. And just go to Oklahoma, go to Nebraska, come to Colorado. Get your hands dirty. Let people see you. Get to know them. Let's reconnect with the American people. The bottom line is this is our moment. And I am a student of history. I've done a lot of reading of biographies and autobiographies of great leaders at our hardest moments in our nation's history. And the conclusion that I've come to is that leaders never get to choose their moment. Whether it's the suffragettes who stood up, whether it's the greatest generation that fought fascism, whether it's the freedom riders that gave their lives and their comfort to fight for civil rights, you never choose your moment. The moment happens. It chooses you. Our only decision is what we are willing to do in our moment, how hard we're willing to work, what we're willing to sacrifice, and whether or not we are willing to step up and lead so that future generations will have their moment as well, and we will preserve our democracy. I am all in with all of you in the fight in the years ahead. I am optimistic that we can come through this, but it's time to get it done, and thank you for having me.
We are plowing through without breaks. I love it. I'm Mark Schmidt. I'm the director of the Political Reform Program here at New America. It's very gratifying to see this room nice and full. It hasn't always been the case in the last few years, so this is really one positive thing. Before I introduce this panel, I just want to say a quick thought about, I've been thinking about the two phrases up there, 100 days and civil society. And 100 days always strikes me because it's a phrase from FDR. And what FDR did in 100 days was build an enormous consensus with Congress and the public around a whole new set of laws and really the foundations of modern government. And it's really striking that that's not what's happened in the last 100 days. What's happened in the last 100 days is a lot of, the big signature on the executive order. It's a very different model of government, and I think we should think about that. For this panel, term civil society, it was interesting that Michael Roth said, colleges and universities didn't always think of themselves as civil society, and those people don't have PhDs and all that. Because I think this next panel is sort of, the definition of civil society is fluid, and there are definitions that even include business and so forth, that however you define the sort of third space. But I think in this next panel, we'll hear from some organizations that really are the kind of core civil society that are really helping organize people, helping build, the legal defense of important causes, and the role that philanthropy can play in that. So we will be joined by Skye Perryman of Democracy Forward, which is really I don't know if she's here. She's here. Okay, great. Which has really been the quintessential organization leading a lot of the litigation here and doing it in a public and visible and engaged way. Dorian Warren, who's the board chair of Community Change, and an old colleague of mine from both worked at the Roosevelt Institute at one point, but Dorian has been a political science professor, but at Community Change deeply engaged with the work of organizing in our communities, and Joe Goldman, who's the president of the Democracy Fund, which is an important ally to all of us, has really been. Democracy Fund is a philanthropy, but also a thought leader on all these issues, and Joe, working with John Palfrey of the MacArthur Foundation, has really stepped up again as a real leader in building that kind of mutual support, I guess, and drawing out some red lines within the community of philanthropy. So come on up, and we will really have as freewheeling a discussion as we can.
Hi. I know, I was here. I was right here.
Welcome, Scott. Welcome to all.
Thank you.
I guess I'd like to, if you don't mind, I would like to start with you, Sky, and I'd love to hear. I don't, you know, we want to have a really open discussion, so we don't have like a big list of questions. But I'd really love to hear your perspective on the kind of work you're doing, both the legal work itself and the whole field that it represents, and you know, as broadly as possible, the zone that you're in of really beginning to both defend and rebuild our democracy.
Thank you. And it's great to be here with all of you. I guess I'll just start by saying that this, and you talk about it, but I just will ground us in it because it's what grounds our work. In 2021, the United States was added to a list of global backsliding democracies. And when researchers go back, they actually think it probably should have been on the list in 2019 or a little bit before that. And it remains and has remained on the list ever since, which is something that really was not overly internalized, I think, in the last 4 years with the American people. And that's in part because the reason we're on this list is because we have institutions that aren't delivering the way they need to deliver. We have a Supreme Court that has actually overturned the rights of people as opposed to protect the rights of people. We have extremism in states across the country. Misinformation, disinformation, election denialism, and the researchers cited a dysfunctional sort of legislative branch. And so the real question in November was not whether we were going to get to, shoot for the heights of inclusion and progressive democracy, but was really rather whether our country was going to be able to slow the backslide and possibly turn the thing around, or whether we were going to be on a vastly accelerating slide towards autocracy. And so I start there to say that our work in this moment is different in some ways than legal work and legal cases that are being filed in maybe more ordinary times, including times where these cases have been incredibly important, of course. But we really look at where we are now as in a changed paradigm, where the new pro-democracy coalition that I think is developing is a new and broader one, and it is really about how we stop and slow this fundamental acceleration to autocracy, and then how do we use this crisis as a catalyst for real change. And so at its broadest level, when you have a situation at the federal level like we have, and when you have state legislatures across the country that, in many instances, have been operating as, small, sort of as microcosms of what we're seeing at the federal level in some sense, the power that the American people have right now, in part, is the power to initiate litigation against their government in defense of their rights and in defense of our constitutional structure and in defense of our system of government. And that litigation is important because it can stop very bad things. We've stopped the federal funding freeze. We've stopped, in some instances, ICE entering into houses of worship. We've been able, on Friday, 3 cases, stopping the Dear Colleague letter and conditioning of funds on particular ideas to violation of the First Amendment, and on and on and on. There's been a lot of wins. But it's not just about what we achieve in the courtroom, because we're in this new paradigm, and the purpose of this litigation in many ways is to show and manifest the power that the American people have, the power that our democracy and our constitutional republic give us in this time. It is the power to defend your rights in courts, but it's also the power to be able to take a moment and breathe and mobilize and speak out and demand that other institutions in our society also be right there with us. And so that, I think, at its broadest place, and over this last 100 days, is how we have really seen our work. And so you may say, well, it seems like you're suing on the civil service, and then you're here on the First Amendment, and then you're here on healthcare and funding freeze, and how do you prioritize this work? Well, all of it that we're doing has a through line. Fundamentally, we are challenging the types of activities that this federal administration has chosen to engage in that fundamentally disrupt a government of, by, and for the the people. There's a through line to that. And when you admit and are willing to look at where we are and not blink, that we are in a situation where we are facing a vastly accelerating autocracy. And our work is really to be a new pro-democracy coalition, not in a talking point way, but in actually we are choosing between those two things, right? Then you give no ground, because that is what you're supposed to do when you're fighting a vastly accelerating autocratic threat. You can't actually let the dear colleague letter sort of just slide by because it's education and education is not really your top issue. You can't allow the Voice of America to become dismantled, and we have stopped that dismantling for now, or Radio Free Asia or the Middle East Broadcasting Network, because you don't really utilize those services, because all of it is an attack on a government of, by, and for the people, and letting some of that seep in creates cracks that can vastly accelerate this backslide to autocracy. So at its broadest level, that is what we are doing. And when we use the courts, it's not necessarily just because we don't believe they're a silver bullet, it's because we believe in the American people. And the tool that the American people have right now is their rights that the Constitution and that our federal laws and that society has given us over time and has recognized, and the ability to initiate litigation to defend those, and then use that litigation not just within the courtroom, but also within the public square.
Thank you so much, Scott. Dorian, I'd love to hear how you're seeing the situation, not, partly in terms of your own organizational work, but really in terms of the organizations you work with out in the field that are often more, don't have the resources or a base necessarily to be as unafraid as, say, Harvard.
Well, thank you, Mark. Thanks for inviting me. I should make one correction. I am co-president of Community Change. I just don't want my board chair mad at me if she's watching.
Always a good thing.
I used to be board chair, and then I stepped up to do. Okay, but that's not important. And I'm saying that also because I want to bring my co-president in the room, my work wife, so to speak, Lorella Praley, who has this great concept of 3 Earths to help us make sense and meaning of the moment. So Earth 1 is sort of what we knew as liberal democracy. And each of these Earths, by the way, has its own toolkit. So Earth 1 are the kind of things that we encourage. I'm a community organizer and an academic. The organizer side of me encourages people to do the things people would do in a liberal democracy. You write a letter to your member of Congress. You go to a town hall. You make phone calls. You might even go to a protest. All great things to do, right? Assuming we still have the freedom of association. I'll come to that in a minute. But that's sort of like Earth 1 in terms of liberal democracy as we knew it. Earth 2 is what we're really, I think, living in now. And you can pick your concept. It's sort of a choose your own adventure. You can choose authoritarianism, you can choose autocracy, you can choose oligarchy, you could choose plutocracy. Did I say autocracy? Like pick your concept, right? Where it's like some combination of those. Might even borrow from and now an old book. It's maybe the new Jim and Jane Crow, if you will. In that Earth 2, it requires a different toolbox. That requires civil resistance. That requires non-cooperation and non-compliance and civil disobedience. I have in my head, because I reread it on April 16th, a letter from a Birmingham jail that Dr. King wrote. Because what was he fighting against? A racial authoritarianism in the South, in the Jim Crow South. That was the reality. So, by the way, authoritarianism isn't new to the US, in case anyone was wondering. We've seen this story before. It's really familiar, actually. And therefore, the toolbox is familiar. We just have to dust it off because, frankly, we're not prepared. And most Americans and the people I organized weren't prepared to have to put their bodies on the line to create a new kind of democracy. So that takes me to then Earth 3. If Earth 1 is liberal democracy as we knew it, Earth 2, and it exists still in some places, Earth 2 is sort of pick your concept, where we find ourselves in this moment that requires a different toolbox. Earth 3 is where we're going. Because we're not going back to Earth 1, in a way. The destruction and damage, as we heard earlier, is too devastating in many ways. So the toolkit we need in Earth 3 is strategic imagination. Where are we going? What is our vision for that? How are we going to build it, and how do we get there? And I think linking those 3 Earths actually helps us to get there, because it will take organizing, it will take civil disobedience, it will take lots of legal strategies across those 3 Earths, by the way, to get to, in some ways, the new planet that we all, since you all do planetary politics here, by the way, I love that title. To get to the new planet, the new Earth that we're seeking, it's going to take a whole bunch of different kinds of tools and different kinds of toolboxes.
Okay. I'm going to pull you back to my original question later, but let me turn it over to...
You said I could talk about whatever I wanted.
I did basically say that. I mean, I loved it. I thought that was brilliant, Dorian, and it makes me think about one of your former colleagues at Columbia the other day said to me, you need to remember Rawls's concept of realistic utopias, and be thinking about the realistic utopias. But I want to turn it over to Joe, and from your perspective as a leader on this philanthropic field, which is in a way, organized philanthropy is targeted in some ways the same way as universities have, and seeing a lot of skittishness, and I want to hear how you think about it, as well as in terms of the actual work you do on democracy.
Stop me if I'm not answering your question. I want to be a good panelist. I want to,
Dorian will get his points back by the end.
Yeah, look, no, great to be here, and really proud to be able to be here with my grantees. So look, philanthropy, similar to the universities, philanthropy is not necessarily the most sympathetic of targets, to the extent that we are targets, right, representing a bunch of billionaires, perhaps that should be kind of governed and managed differently by society. But at the end of the day, we should care about philanthropy because we care about the nonprofit sector that philanthropy is here to support. And I think it is absolutely the case that this administration believes that philanthropy is a source of opposition that needs to be cowed in this moment, and we're on the target list. I think we are lucky to have not been first up, right? The universities and Big Law and others have actually received the brunt of attacks first, and that has given some time for philanthropy and parts of the nonprofit sector to actually organize and kind of understand the patterns that are coming. And the really great thing that we've kind of seen over the course of the last few weeks is philanthropy and nonprofits organizing. The presidents of the MacArthur, McKnight, and Freedom Together foundations put out a letter 2 weeks ago, basically calling on philanthropy to band together and stand up for our grantees, to have their backs. And last I checked, we've got more than 500 foundations that have signed on to that letter. The goal was to representing all 50 states. I think we're at like 48 states at this point. And that's a great first step. What happens when the actual targeting occurs and folks start feeling a different kind of pressure? We're going to see, but I've seen a tremendous amount of organizing across philanthropy, kind of writ large, and also kind of within different, the climate funders, the immigration funders, the folks who focus in different regions of the country, family foundations, right? There is a tremendous amount of organizing, and that's what's important in this moment, right? That we do not kind of adopt this posture of, well, I need to duck down in order to protect myself. Rather, I'm going to stand up with others. And I think that is the mentality at this point, and that's what we need to get through this.
Thank you, Joe. Can I ask you a different question? How much...
Did I not answer your
question?
question?
You did. Everybody did great. I'm just joking around.
Did I do better, though?
Great. You'll all get scores in a day or two after we meet and analyze. No, Joe, I'm just curious, how much do you think philanthropy will deal with the pressure to fill in where things have been taken away? I mean, for example, I just saw that the Mellon Foundation is making a bunch of grants to help fund the state humanities councils that were all cut off, which is, they're lovely institutions. Those are not gazillions of dollars. There's clearly going to be a lot of that. And how are philanthropy leaders thinking about that increased demand?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's a degree to which it is simply impossible for philanthropy to step into the role that government is stepping back from. Right? There is not a world in which philanthropy plays the role of USAID. Right? That just is not going to happen. I think we have seen a bunch of examples of kind of philanthropies expanding their commitments, expanding the resources that they're putting, whether it's the Mellon Foundation example that you provided or the Gates Foundation stepping in for some of the foreign aid reductions. So I think we're certainly seeing some, but philanthropy can't replace government and shouldn't.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think that, we're also seeing the beginnings of conversations, and hopefully there'll be more, and then there'll be actions, right? But the beginnings of conversations of like what conditions will be needed when the rebuild and as we rebuild. And I think that's a place where, of course, philanthropy can really help catalyze so much of that thinking and doing in these times, while we also have to have philanthropy supporting the doing happening now to try to see what we can hold of so many of the rights and institutions that we do that are not perfect, but that we do rely on to protect people.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of lessons that we all need to internalize from what has taken place over the course of the last decade. But one of the ones that has been most important for me is that to a great extent, the pro-democracy community has, in this kind of jujitsu kind of way, been put in the position of defending broken and unpopular institutions and systems that we don't necessarily agree with and believe is best for America over these last several years. And so, I think the opportunity of the moment is to imagine the kind of country we want to live in and the kind of institutions and systems that we need and work towards them. And that is, I think, a role for the civic sector.
Dorian, I do want to pull you. All I want is I'm just curious.
Penalty box.
A little perspective of the kind of organizations, the kind of community-based organizations you work with. What are they experiencing? Yeah. How are they able to respond? What's the level of panic and so forth?
I'll add to your question, so to not answer it. So I work with both community-based organizations, mostly who organize in low-income communities across race, various jurisdictions like Jackson, Mississippi to Montana. So see a lot across the country. I also work with other national organizations, so think Move On or Indivisible, or some labor unions like SEIU. So I have some insight there as well. And why I raise those national organizations like mine is because most of us have resources. I have a general counsel. Most of those institutions have lawyers, have access to resources like Joe, whereas grassroots groups do not. So part of, I think, what has to happen is many of us have to redistribute some of our resources to groups on the ground that are fearful, that are suffering, that might need some help in terms of C3, C4 distinctions, right, that we can provide, but most importantly, have to be part of a larger community of folks resisting and fighting back so that they know they're not alone and that it's not as scary and risky for them to take a step out. There is amazing organizing work happening all over the country around a range of issues. The on-ramps to the pro-democracy movement are wide and varied. People are very motivated about potential loss of things like Medicaid or SNAP or Social Security. People have been fighting for a long time around high-quality, affordable childcare. They're still interested, right, in that issue, and they're still passionate about that issue, and that brings them into the pro-democracy camp writ large. There's still a racial justice movement around policing and around school segregation and employment. So there is organizing happening. We might not see it all the time, say, on cable news. That doesn't mean it's not happening, but really, to answer your question, there is a mix of courage, of people doing really brave things with little to no resources, And I would say there is a lot of fear too about, and especially for grassroots groups, I work with probably a dozen that do rely on government support. And so for those organizations, they are facing existential crises, particularly if they have federal grants of any kind. And so to Joe's point, philanthropy can fill in a little bit, but there are some deeper existential questions. And frankly, we're probably going to lose a lot of organizations in civil society in this next period because many won't be able to survive. And I also think that new ones are going to pop up. There's a group here in DC I'm very familiar with called Free DC. It just started in January. They have thousands of new members. And I'll close on this point. They have thousands of new members. They're based in every single ward in the district. They do weekly orientations of recruiting people to these meetings because people are looking for vehicles to fight back. Let me be very clear about that. Ordinary people are looking for vehicles to fight back against the loss of freedom, against a range of things. And we haven't always in civil society and community organizing provided those on-ramps for people. And now is the moment. And so Free DC has been recruiting thousands of people. And then on Saturdays, because I mentioned Toolbox 1 that of showing up to protests, going to town hall meetings, calling your representatives. On Saturdays, they teach people Toolbox 2. What does civil resistance look like? What does non-cooperation look like? What does de-escalation look like? What does those kinds of things that are required under authoritarian systems? They're doing both of those. They're doing the Toolbox 1, Toolbox 2, and they have trained thousands of people already in just the first 100 days. So there's an appetite and demand for all the scholarship on how, we're all bowling alone and people aren't joining things. People are joining. Yeah. People are joining. People are signing up. People are looking to get in the fight, and it's our job to give them the on-ramps to get into the fight.
And notably, those are not organizations that are just like sending you lots of emails and collecting your money. That's the big difference.
I'll just say we have spoken in the last maybe 2 months to over the best we can estimate about 300,000 individual people who have been coming to teletown halls across the country. And they want to hear from their member of Congress, the ones that are holding the teletown halls, which we appreciate. Many of the president's allies are not holding the teletown halls right now. But the ones that are holding teletown halls, they're showing up. And they're actually interested in hearing about the wins, right? About the stories, even if it's something that doesn't necessarily affect their community directly. They want to hear about what a court did here, what a court did there, or which group of people sort of stood up. And so we are staffing at night, not our lawyers because they're working at night to get into court, but many of our other team members are staffing these town halls for anyone that wants to. That's unbelievable for an organization that principally is a legal one. And tomorrow, we're going to launch a program called Dinners for Democracy and Coffee for Change because we cannot get ourselves in and out of a community wherever we go without people who you would not think would be the people running up to us to say, what can we do? How can we engage? And so these are going to be some interventions and things that groups and grassroots groups can use to connect to larger national networks. But we're only at, day 100, right? And you're already seeing this quite energized energy, I think, sort of throughout the country, including in communities that are seen as sort of red communities or red state communities in this moment, given the choices the administration has made around their policy agenda, where they really haven't governed for any particular community. And so I think that we're energized by that. It's not to say it's not going to be very hard, but we're energized by that.
Joe, what are you seeing in terms of like the on-ramps to organizing and democracy? What's like inspiring to you?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think this has been referred to several times across today's panels, but an emergency creates an organizing moment. And at the bottom line, whether we're thinking about the slow movement of the universities to now kind of come together and start getting active, or what we're seeing in a example. I also am a big fan of Free DC. I think they do phenomenal work. But in any of these sectors. I think people are experiencing pain. They are experiencing loss, and that creates an opportunity to engage. And I think we are all seeing that across the board.
Great. I think we have some time for questions from in the room, in the middle back there in the back. Sorry to. Yeah, I think it'd be good if you wait because we have the people online. And it'd be great if you say who you are.
Hi, I'm Deborah Kobus. I'm a senior fellow at the Urban Institute. So you'll see this is a slightly self-serving question, but I really appreciate all your comments. And Skye, I've been a groupie. I've been following you on your speaking tour, basically. So thank you. We've heard about the role of higher education, the role of the organizing that's emerging among nonprofits, the organizing that's emerging under philanthropy, and this is hosted now at a think tank, right? So I'm really curious about where you see the role of collective action for think tanks and what is our role in the conversation, either as leaders of think tanks coming together or how we can support the efforts of collective action around the country.
I think that's a great question for Mark to answer. Given that he works at a think tank.
All I was going to say is, as you know, Deborah, this event kind of came together out of some conversations among people across think tanks. But I'd love to hear what others think. To me, I often frame it as how to make sure we're relevant in a moment of crisis, especially often think tanks are working collaboratively with government and things like that, where that's going to be obviously tougher. I'd be curious how you all see that.
I mean, I guess one thing I'd say, I think people are looking for a plan, right? We released results of a survey. We surveyed a few hundred democracy philanthropies and donors, and kind of to get their sense of the moment. And the most kind of overwhelming statement that came out of that survey was 70% of the democracy funders that we surveyed said that they did not have confidence that we've got a plan to get out of the mess that we're in. And my sense in general, if I think about the donor community, it's not that I'm seeing people back away from their commitment to democracy, back away from kind of their desire to fund this work. But I do see them asking really hard questions about what have we learned about how we got here, and what do we know about how we get out? And I think one of the roles that hopefully the think tank community is coming up with plans, really interrogating ideas and helping give us a sense of where to go. So I guess that would be my answer.
I agree with that and would just say I think that there has been good scholarship, particularly in the democracy space, that has come out that has really helped those of us that are in more of the advocacy and legal spaces and other spaces to understand the moment that we're in and not treat it just like it's the next, just another Tuesday or something like that. But I do think that both the plans around rebuild, but the other thing is, for better or worse, and unfortunately I think it's going to be for worse, there is about to be a lot of data that will be generated that will unfortunately prove what good data, but not maybe indisputable data, has said for some time, whether you're talking about Medicaid access, whether you're talking about access to reproductive health care or urban transport or interventions in rural areas, because all of these things are at risk of being quite decimated. There will be impacts that will be had from that, and someone that's not in the direct services world and that's not actually on the front lines of trying to stop much of that destruction right now has got to study it to make the policy case and to learn what we can learn from this moment. So I think that that's the other piece, and I know that Urban Institute and others in the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, was able to utilize data that was tragically, it's tragic circumstances, but then to really understand what we can learn from that and how that can create potentially a leapfrogging situation where we have to build back not what was there, but build back something that is much more advanced and inclusive and things that meet the moment if they're going to destroy everything. There's this opportunity in this crisis for a catalyst. And I think that the engine of that in a large part is the research institutions, think tanks, et cetera.
And of course, the data itself, there's a lot of data.
The data itself, which the
threatened.
government may or may not be collecting. And so I think there's a huge role there.
I think 3 quick thoughts. The first I'll pick up off of you, Skye, and that is for the dismantling of data collection that the federal government used to do, I do think that is a role for think tanks to step into the breach until we can reconstruct those systems. The loss of data is just devastating in so many ways to tell us all the things, right? How we're doing, especially issues of equity. That's 1. 2, I would say, in the room at least, raise your hand if you've heard of Project 2025. Where was that created? I believe it was a think tank of some kind.
Some kind.
So where is our Project 2029 or 2035? There is some really vital work to help us think about and get to that Earth 3 that I mentioned earlier. Who is doing that work? And I also believe strongly in sort of a full blade of grass approach. So yes, I organize at the grassroots level. That's necessary. We need grass tops organizing as well. And then who are the connectors between the grass tops and the grassroots? And by that I mean, I want to encourage you, those of you at think tanks, not to develop ideas solely in like away from ordinary people. But like, what is the listening that you're also doing? Because people I talk to have ideas too. They don't have the resources to do white papers, but we need the white papers, by the way. But they have ideas too. So what is the relationship between some of the grass tops ideas generation work and some of the grassroots organizing that can actually come together in a broader movement and motivate people to fight for something? That is, I think, the key challenge, at least from where I sit. We need the think tank infrastructure, for sure, and we need to figure out better ways to be connected to the think tank infrastructure so the ideas isn't happening here and the people organizing isn't happening over here.
One of the things people often ask me, just like relatives or whatever, like, what's the most important work that's happening? What's going on? And I'm like, everybody actually has different jobs to do. And if, the legal cases are probably the most essential short-term thing, but they can't be the only thing.
They rest on all the other
And
stuff.
they rest on all the other stuff, and everybody's, some people have to be doing campaigns for 2026, and other people everybody's got to do what they do best, but respect and work with others. I think, Anne-Marie, you had your hand up before. But you might have to wait also.
Hi, Anne-Marie Slaughter, CEO, and it's wonderful to have you all here. So, Skye, I was wondering, when you're talking about your democracy dinners, because I also just talking to folks in my communities, my friends, they want to be engaged. Are these explicitly across difference, or that's what? Yeah.
Yeah. So, and I'm gonna take. I have a lot of plans for you, and the democracy dinners and your friends. So it will launch tomorrow. It'll be on our website. But we have actually they meet people where they are. So there are 3 different tracks. One is an action track. So there are lots of people, and we go to communities across the country, and it's not just that they're watching what's happening here in Washington, right? But they're also their public radio station, their local public radio station has been defunded. Their library board is being taken over by people that don't want books about history in their library. And so there's a lot of local issues that do ladder up to these, frankly, national and international and global significant issues in order to help people come together, identify something in their own community, and then tap that into some of the national conversation. That's one track. Another track would be for the doers who are just exhausted and who need a place to come together to just take care of each other and create community and rest for each other. So you actually do just get to have your, relaxing dinner or coffee. And one of the reasons we had to is that some of this, it's not to be overwhelming. And then the third is exactly that, is actually encouraging people to use the space that they're creating to build bridges across difference, whether that's political difference, whether it's demographic difference, whether it's religious difference. So there's 3 different tracks, and because that's what we're hearing from people, is that they actually, some really want to engage and they want to have guest speakers and they want to take on a local issue. Others are just exhausted. And rest and care for their communities is actually what needs to happen in this moment. And then others really do want to reach out and reach across, or they're now finding that there's uniting, this overreach that's happening is actually uniting people, and they're meeting and interfacing with people who may not be part of the traditional community that they've created, and so they want that difference. So we hope we'll report back, and we'll take you all up on having your dinner or your coffee for change, and we'll see where that is.
That sounds wonderful, Sky. We're getting close to the end. I'd like really kind of last words or last thoughts, things you want to make sure don't go unsaid.
So Sky and I actually co-wrote an op-ed last week, maybe, that tried to lay out kind of a agenda for the nonprofit sector and philanthropy in this moment. So I think it'd be kind of worthwhile to just note, like, what we really focused on were 3 things, right? That in this moment, we need to do what we can to defend civil society, to, everything that we've talked about today across these panels, ensure that there are spaces for vigorous thought and advocacy and opposition, and that we're protecting the civic sector to be able to do that work. We need to ensure that we are creating real accountability for the harms and damages that are being created on a daily basis, and do all that we can along those lines. And at the end of the day, right, we need to make sure that as we're doing all of this work now, we're thinking about what's coming, and what's coming is going to be an election season. And we need to ensure that we have free and fair elections to ensure that the American people have a formal voice to weigh in on what's been happening in these moments, and really want to kind of call on others to join in those priorities to drive that work forward.
I would just say that now is not, if you're here, you're probably not on the sidelines, but now is really not a time to be on the sidelines. Every minute that we are able to both defend civil society, but also create that hope and the work and the new, it's really inspiring, the new coalitions that are coming together, the new communities that are being merged in this moment. There's a real opportunity there. And so people have been saying courage is contagious, which I love that. I'm saying courage is the new currency, and you don't have to find courage alone. You find it in communities with others, and really using this opportunity, this crisis, as a catalyst for new ways of thinking while doing that day-to-day work of defending civil society, I think is what we want to make sure everybody's doing.
I love that. I would say a couple of things. One, if you don't belong to something, join something. If you already are a member of something, join another group. And most importantly, so I don't have to go to jail, pay dues. Like, you all can contribute something. Ideally, we'd all be self-funded as organizations in civil society. 3, I would say, recruit probably 4 to 5 people in your social network or family to engage the rest of the year in conversation and to do things together with. Go to one of Sky's dinners. Go to a protest, they're fun. Go to a rally, do something together, but recruit. All of you are organizers. We're all organizers in our own social networks. So you should feel empowered in this moment to recruit 4 or 5 people to do things with and make a commitment to do those things with them the rest of the year.
Thank you all so much. I want to thank old friends and new, and thank you all for being here, and thanks to all of you.
All right, home stretch. Hi, everyone. My name is Yulia Panfil. I'm the director of New America's Future of Land and Housing program. I am one of the organizers of today's event, and I'm the last thing between you and the reception. So I will be very quick. Yes, did we mention there's a reception? First, I would really like to thank all of our amazing speakers and panelists and everyone who helped to organize this event. Mark mentioned it very briefly, but actually this event came together as a result of the efforts of multiple programs within New America, as well as multiple organizations and individuals within those organizations, between 30 and 40 organizations that have formed a loose organization called the Constitutional Collaborative that's been working together to try to figure out how best to meet this moment. Constitutional Collaborative members, a reminder that we're meeting informally at 4:30 across the hall. And so I'll just end by going back to where Bill Traynor began a couple hours ago. He said, "I'm much more optimistic now than I was a month ago." And that really resonates with me. A month ago, even a few weeks ago, I felt a lot of despair. I felt as though we were being steamrolled and the zone was being flooded and we were flat-footed and we were panicking. And now I don't see panic, I see organizing. And I see just from the multiple panelists who have all shared how they have stood up and are standing up through litigation, through organizing, through funding, through the Big Ten, NATO, by standing up and not capitulating. I think that gives me hope. The collection of all of us together, this is an act of collective courage. I applaud everyone who had the courage to share their thoughts here today. As Representative Crow said, you never choose your moment, and this feels like it is our moment, and I'm glad that we're meeting it and that we're exhibiting this courage together. So with that, I would like to thank everyone for coming and enjoy the reception.